Good evening and welcome to the 2022 James Q. Wilson Lecture. Each year, we gather here to celebrate the legacy of a great public intellectual and to learn about the issues he cared so deeply about. Professor Wilson delivered this lecture himself for a decade and a half. He was one of the most influential political scientists of his time, and he broke new ground on a wide range of subjects. Faced with a surge in violent crime that scarred America's cities in the 1960s and 70s, Wilson revolutionized our understanding of policing, and with George Kelling developed the broken windows theory of criminal justice that helped make New York safe. He shed light on the nature of bureaucracy and the biological and behavioral underpinnings of morality. And there's a good chance he co-authored the civics textbook you used in high school or college, too. Since Professor Wilson's death in 2012, we've continued this event to celebrate his life and work with a fitting successor, Ed Glaeser, the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics at Harvard University, one of the nation's most celebrated and impactful social scientists, delivering the lecture. Professor Glaeser's work is similarly wide-ranging, with a focus on the promise and perils of urban life. His papers have made seminal contributions to the literature on housing supply, real estate bubbles, the rise of entrepreneurial clusters, the politics of redistribution, transportation infrastructure, and much else. His books include 2011's Triumph of the City and last year's more somber Survival of the City, written with David Cutler. It should go without saying that Professor Glaeser's expertise is much needed right now. America's great cities are entering an uncertain era. They are dealing with the challenge of remote work and with elevated crime. And they are facing a dire shortage of housing supply, which has spread from coastal areas to afflict much of the country. Home prices rose 44% over the past 2 years. The Fed's anti-inflation efforts may cool this market, but the simple fact will remain that there aren't enough homes in the cities where people want to live the most, places with jobs, good schools, and opportunities for upward mobility. It's a challenging moment for our cities, but no one knows what makes cities flourish better than Professor Glaeser. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be back. I was just thinking that, in fact, my first significant public presentation on housing occurred in this room 20 years ago in a previous MI event. So I'm delighted to be back talking about housing here. Now, I'm going to make three fundamental points. The first of which is, as Rehan just said, that when I spoke 20 years ago, this was a coastal city phenomenon. This was an issue of an overregulated New York and overregulated California that had made it increasingly difficult to provide ordinary people with affordable homes. It has become a far more national phenomenon. It's become something that you see in the Tony suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, or Dallas, or other parts of the country that had been previously thought to be relatively unregulated places where we could go and find opportunity if we got zoned out in New York or San Francisco. Second point, this is a phenomenon that has truly macroeconomic repercussions. I will highlight 4 of these in the talk, but when I spoke about this 20 years ago, I was focused on one thing and one thing only: how much did this add to the cost of living in New York, right? Which is an interesting and important topic, but it is a very microeconomic perspective, right? The freezing of America's neighborhoods, the freezing of our housing markets, is something which in fact has implications for the economy that go far beyond that. The third point that I'm going to make is that we are on a now familiar roller coaster of housing prices. Typically what happens is that the reform movement, the YIMBYists of today, the much more select group of us who were involved in this before 2006, who feel like we're suddenly making a little bit of headway, right? As prices rise, then all of a sudden as prices fall, boom, you're done. No one's interested in this topic anymore. Why are we worrying about housing affordability in 2008 or in a world of 2023 where perhaps interest rates have pushed housing prices down substantially? Reform cannot work like that. Every major reform effort we've ever had in this country has taken time, and if we're going to let the whipsaw of the housing bubble determine when we care about this issue and when we don't, right, we will lose any conceivable way of making headway to creating an America that is more affordable, more productive, more flexible, more fair. Okay, so first, this is the nominal Case-Shiller price indices, and you can see both in nominal terms just the extraordinary event that we've had since 2019. Okay, so it has been an unbelievable run-up during COVID. I'm not sure we fully understand the demand side of that. Some part of it is certainly that working from home means that you want a nicer home to work in. Some part of it is COVID-era disruptions in terms of the difficulty of bringing new supply to market. But I want to highlight a particular thing, which is if you look at the green line is my warning sign. So that green line is Dallas. And if you look at what happened to Dallas in 2005, 2006, it didn't move. Just as Atlanta didn't move, right? Most of unconstrained America behave the way that unconstrained markets are supposed to work, which is the quantities go up and down. They build during a boom, they don't build during a bust, but the prices stay relatively steady. Look at what's happened to Dallas prices in nominal terms over the last 12 years, right? Really an extraordinary change in the housing values there. This shows 5 cities. From LA, Phoenix, Dallas, New York, and Atlanta. These places are, in these cases I've actually done what economists are always supposed to do, which is to control for inflation, which I didn't do in the previous graph. And here you can see Atlanta is, of course, way up at the head of the pack. Phoenix has now passed in real terms where they were during the previous bubble. And what's really great to know is they permitted as much as last year as they did in 2005. So we know how that combination tends to work out. Dallas looks nothing like it ever has in the past. In fact, it looks like it's gone up more than New York has since the early start of this millennium. And there is Atlanta, which is also going up, but it's still behaving a little bit more like Atlanta historically has. And I'll give you more on Atlanta later. So this is really the spreading of this stuff. This just shows the change in prices. These are, again, real prices over the pandemic itself and the amount of building. And in those places where you see building really being quite substantial, this is 2 to 3% of population in terms of the housing unit. So this is Austin, Texas. Phoenix is also building a great deal. Those places are places where I would think, historically when you've seen high, really sharp increases in housing prices, at the same time they're building an awful lot. Those are areas in which you should be most sure to expect a correction going forward. But despite the fact that much is likely to be temporary, some is likely to be temporary, much is likely to be permanent. And this shows real housing prices, real rents in LA since 1950, and the housing production in the previous decade. And you can see in the 50s and 60s, when LA was starting off of a much smaller base, right, they were producing a lot more housing. Over the course of the last 60 years, not quite as dramatically as New York City, where the drop in housing permits is even more extreme and the rise in prices is even more extreme. But the quantities certainly drop off, particularly, of course, the 90s, which is the nadir of production. And you can see the prices, the housing rents going dramatically up. Again, these are all real rents. These are all correcting for inflation. LA was affordable. Most of California was affordable in the 1970s because for most of the past 20 years prior to that, California had been a builder's paradise, right? Increasingly a set of rules, often environmental in justification, although not in effect, right? Because in fact, restricting building in coastal California is in fact the last thing you want to do if you actually care about reducing global emissions. This is a naturally temperate place, and if you build there, you require much less energy than if you build outside of Houston or you build outside of Phoenix. And yet nonetheless, often for alleged environmental justifications, an increasing web of rules came and restricted what could be done in California, and the result was rising prices. And in case anyone is, I've shown this in a prior James Q. Wilson lecture, but I still like the graph a lot. I would just want to highlight it again. If anyone is doubtful that these housing prices relate to supply rather than demand, this graph and a little bit of memory from Economics 101 should, set that to rest. If the only thing that's differing is demand across areas, if supply conditions are roughly the same, then the places that are expensive, right, are also the places that are building a lot, okay? If, on the other hand, you see that the places that are expensive don't build a lot, and the places that build a lot aren't expensive, then the only way to interpret that using the standard canon of economics is that there are supply differences that are meaningful across place. And so this is the permits between 2000 and 2013 over the 2000 housing stock. So along the x-axis, along the horizontal axis, is the amount of building. Along the y-axis, along the vertical axis, is the price relative to the marginal physical cost of construction. So how much more does it cost to buy a house than it costs to build a house? And what you can see is the places that build a lot, and in these days those numbers are Austin, Raleigh, Las Vegas, Charleston, Atlanta, Orlando, Houston, those places are not expensive. And the places that are really expensive, with names like New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles, those places don't build a lot. There's no way of rationalizing that data without thinking that, look, there is demand for San Francisco real estate. Right? You wouldn't have high prices otherwise. There's demand for Austin real estate. Otherwise, you wouldn't have 50% growth over the course of a 13-year period. Right? In one place, it shows up in high prices and essentially no change in the overall size of the area, no change in the number of housing units. In the other place, it shows up in a ridiculously expensive housing stock that is impossible to build it. This comes from Joe Jerko's work. Joe Jerko and his co-authors, including Anita Summers, Albert Saez, they've gone out and surveyed people who are involved in the planning process throughout America's metropolitan areas, and they do it for different localities. They then index it up, and what this shows you is the share of land in each one of these metropolitan areas that is in the top fourth of the zoning restrictiveness according to their index. So, metropolitan areas differ. Some parts of even the New York metropolitan area are relatively less controlled, right? But everything that's in the top quartile, you should think this is a pretty restricted piece of real estate, okay? And this gives you a picture of America. So San Francisco is the most. These numbers don't go down monotonically because this is the overall average rather than the share. It's how they're ranked. San Francisco is the most on average, and 78% of the land within greater San Francisco is in one of this top quartile in terms of zoning regulation. There's really 22% of the land is not as regulated, and that's mostly water and hills anyway. New York is actually less so. 65% of the New York metropolitan area is in this ultra-high regulated area, but there are more parts in sort of the outlying areas of greater New York that are slightly less hyper-regulated. But look at some of the other places that are there, right? Phoenix, 55% of land in greater Phoenix is in one of these ultra-high regulated areas. It's sort of amazing that they're still building as much as they are, still permitting as much as they are, but it does suggest that where they're permitting is not in the prime areas that are in, are in Scottsdale, they're in the highest demand areas. They're places that are in the outlying areas of that desert metropolis. Miami, 51%. Boston is surprisingly a little bit lower at 39%. Look at the, Indianapolis is great. Indianapolis is only 14%. So Indianapolis, like Columbus, Ohio, tends to be sort of a Rust Belt city that really skews Sun Belt in terms of the way that they operate, and they get the benefits from that both of these cities are quite business-friendly cities in the American Midwest. And you see them both, they did quite well over the COVID period, and you see much more economic and housing dynamism there. And then on this side, there are some places that are sort of in the colder parts of America where there just hasn't been big demand for housing, like Cincinnati or Rochester. And then there are a lot of places in the Sun Belt as well. If you look at changes, so they did an earlier index about 20 years ago, and they compared that with the new index. And what this is showing you is the share of communities that are getting more regulated and the share of the communities that are getting less regulated. So the West Coast, 65% are getting more regulated, 15% are getting less regulated. Okay? 22% no net change. West Coast, not coastal, 61% more regulated, 28% less. East Coast, that's us, 59% more, 21% less, right? So even though there is something of a YIMBY movement, there are occasionally spurts of attempts to deregulate housing. The overall trend in the coastal markets is strongly positive. Even the Sun Belt, which we would have historically thought of as being the place that grew partially because it was friendly, right? You don't understand the growth of Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, and Phoenix over the past 20 years without understanding that these places make it remarkably easy to mass produce housing, right? And yet even there, 52% have gotten more regulated as opposed to only 33% the other way. Now, there is only one region, the mountain region, which has moved in the other direction, which is a sort of fascinating thing, that there are parts of the mountain region in the US. And the Rust Belt, it looks more or less balanced. These are areas where demand is typically pretty low. And so what you do in terms of supply regulation is less important, in the Rust Belt at least. Okay, now, those are facts about what's changing. The macroeconomic implications of the closing of the metropolitan frontier. I'm going to highlight 4. One of which is when you restrict the supply of something, you make asset bubbles far more likely. Okay? When a supply is, when a good is supplied elastically by a normally functioning market, right, you don't have bubbles in this, right? So take an ordinary product, TVs, right? You don't have times when all of a sudden, like the price of an ordinary TV, I guess you could have a supply chip thing where it's really vital, but in general, it's not going to go up by 300% over a 2-year period, because you know what? They can make TVs in lots of different places, right? And so that elastic supply ensures that the prices aren't going to get out of whack. When housing works correctly, It's a good in which it's relatively easy to build, and the prices are held down by the construction costs. Whereas if you have a good that is in absolutely fixed supply, right? It's a Rembrandt. They're not making any more of those things. This is an area in which you can have booms and busts far more readily. Second point, you have a breakdown in the movement of labor to places in which it is more productive. Americans have, throughout our entire history, reallocated ourselves to places where there was economic opportunity. That has increasingly stopped precisely because we cannot build, we cannot buy homes, we cannot rent homes in places that are much more economically productive. Consequently, the whole economy is stuck in less productive places of America, and that has a long-term implication for America's economic growth. I'm just going to quote from Shea Moretti on that when we get to there. And finally, upward mobility is reduced. So if you believe that there's a sort of generational problem in America, that we are ceasing to find upward mobility for our kids, right? Some of Raj Chetty's work has suggested that some part of that must relate to the fact that our high opportunity parts of America are much more restrictive than our low opportunity parts of America. Okay, so this is just obviously, there's a lot more things that can be done statistically on this that I have done on housing bubbles and the nature of construction elasticities, but two examples of two metropolitan areas really bear this out. So Atlanta, until the last 10 years, was a paradigmatic example of an unconstrained metropolitan area. The orange line shows what happens to prices. The green line shows what's happening to the amount of building. What you can see here over the course of the housing bubble event of 2001 to 2010 is you get a pretty big swing in the amount of building. What happens to prices? Steady as a rock. Okay? People believe at this point in time that it's always going to be easy to build in Atlanta. Construction costs are more or less tying down the price of construction, and so it was in most of America that was easy to build during this time period. Now, let's take what's our polar opposite, San Francisco. San Francisco, the two shapes are the same, it's just the colors are reversed. Because the one that's shooting up and down is prices, right, which is undergoing a huge roller coaster, right? Whereas what's happening to permits? Nada, right? Nothing. There's no increase in permits to a visible scale during this thing. I mean, like, it's epsilon in terms of the relative to Atlanta. And so what happens when you restrict quantity is that all of a sudden you cause that extra energy, whether or not it's coming from rational investment or the mania of crowds and buyers, right? That shows up all in the spiraling up and down of prices, which at least the last time we had a housing bubble did fairly awful things for the macroeconomy as it collapsed. Second point, this comes from the work of Ganong and Shoag. First thing we're showing you is the path of migration, so annual population growth rate, 1940 to 1960. This is at the state level, and its relationship to income per capita in 1940. This is called directed migration. It has been a feature of American life for 200 years, that in fact people have tended to move where there's higher income, and population growth has tended to be higher in places that have, pay higher wages. Right? Think back historically to farmers leaving the rocky soil of New England to find the richer soil of the Ohio River Valley, or people leaving the Dust Bowl to move to California, or people leaving the farms of the South to move to Atlanta and other places of opportunity in the late 19th century. Right? This has always been part of how America worked. I remember, right? I talked about Manker Olson and the sort of his vision of how stable societies accrue regulations and accrue interest groups that stop new economic activity. I remember when I read this in the 1990s, and the reason why it didn't look like America to me was even though it sounded a bit like New York City, I knew we still had Texas. Right? I knew we still had Atlanta. I knew we still had places that weren't overregulated where Americans could find some sort of a brighter future. And that was exactly what was going on here. Now, look at 1990, the same graph. It's done. It's done. Okay? Because the high-income parts of the country, right, and you can see where they are. What are the highest income per capita? MA, NJ, NY, and CT. Right? No population growth in those places. How could there be? You don't allow any housing to be constructed in these places. So naturally, they're going to, they're going to stay high incomes, and they're not going to see the same level of population growth that historically has enabled America to move to places that are productive. One consequence of this is that there has been a substantial decline in regional convergence. So the work of my colleague Robert Barrow and Javier Sally-Martin 30 years ago documented that prior to 1990, pretty much throughout American history, there had been very substantial mean reversion at the place level. Places that started poor gained income much more quickly than places that started rich. This is exactly what you see here. This is the 40 to 60 version of it. Huge negative slope, right? You start poor, you get much faster income growth than if you start rich. Oddly, this fact that they documented it appears to have stopped essentially at the moment that they documented it. Not completely going to zero, but pretty much so. And you can see this over there, a huge flattening. One argument for why this flattened is that you had this delinking of the ability to actually build more housing in places where incomes were higher. And so those places didn't have a flood of new migrants who pulled wages down and added to the overall productive base. Instead, they had just higher prices in perpetuity. I believe this is some part of this, right, of the enduring joblessness in America's eastern heartland. So one of the things that's happened, possibly partially because of the closing of the America's metropolitan frontier, is that you've had this great rise in prime age male joblessness. Prime age is, of course, defined as being between the ages of 25 to 54, which I'm sure all of you who are on the wrong side of that find as offensive as I do. This is not, this has risen. The prime age not working rate has risen from 5% in 1967 to 15% over much of the last 15 years, and it is not spatially neutral. There are parts of America, especially the eastern heartland, where over 25% of prime age men are not working. Right? And often have not been working for a long time. Why don't they get out? Right? There's a huge gap in wages between these places, between West Virginia and San Francisco. Some part of it is just the extraordinary difference in the cost of living in these areas, which has got to be huge. Some part of it is 1/3 of prime age working men who are even people in their 40s. Right? They're living in their parents' homes. And their parents actually live in West Virginia or Eastern Tennessee. They don't live in San Francisco. And so the housing is sort of the tyranny that keeps them locked in place. Okay. This is much more debatable, and I will. The basic sign is right. The magnitudes are large. Whether or not this number is a number that I completely believe is unclear. But what they're doing is they're quantifying the amount of spatial misallocation of labor across America and its aggregate costs. Right? I'll just read it. Misallocation arises because high productivity cities like New York and the San Francisco Bay Area have adopted stringent restrictions to new housing supply, effectively limiting the number of workers who have access to such high productivity. Using a spatial equilibrium model and data from 220 metropolitan areas, we find that these constraints lowered aggregate U.S. growth by 36% between 1964 and 2009. Okay? That is a substantial thing if America's growth is 1/3 lower than it otherwise should be, because we have made it difficult for places like New York and San Francisco to grow. This is the fact that I said beforehand. This uses the Chetty et al. Measures of opportunity, and opportunity is measured by what happens if you're born at the 25th percentile of the income distribution, so 3/4 of parents are richer than your parents, 1/4 are poorer. Where do you end up in the income distribution yourself? Okay, I sort metropolitan areas on the basis of this, and then I average this Wharton Land Use Index by these areas. And what you can see is there's a massive difference between the places of opportunity, which are highly restrictive, and the places without opportunity that are not. Right? When we zone out these highly attractive, high education areas, we are actually zoning out Americans who are trying to find a future that is better than their parents. They're trying to find the American dream. Okay, so this is all diagnostic. Okay, so how can we possibly change this? How can we do more than just and I think, I go back and forth on this every for 6 to 7 years in the last decade, well, the decade before last, I put a fair amount of effort into this. Then I kind of gave up after the downturn for a while. I started working on cities in the developing world. I think this is now too big of a national issue for us not to give this every push that we can. Okay, claim number one. There is no chance of persuading homeowners in prosperous suburbs to change their zoning rules because you say it'd be good for the country for them to do this, right? I have had zero success in it. I don't know anyone who's had any success in it, right? It's asking someone who's a suburban homeowner to take actions that are meant to lower the value of their largest asset. How is that ever going to work? Okay, it's still fun to mock them sometimes, but that's not a that doesn't really get you very far. Bigger cities, and I'll show you a little piece of data on this, the bigger the jurisdiction, the more open they are to zoning. So New York will be far more open than, choose your favorite, place in Westchester County. Because there are employers, because there are banks, because there are people who actually understand that they want to have lower costs for their employees. In fact, the most impressive speech I've ever given for housing reform during the previous reign was given was at a summit involving this with Governor Mitt Romney, right? Think about how long ago this is, given by the CEO of Legal Seafoods, right? And he was sufficiently concerned with the high cost of paying for his workers that he was able to make an impassioned speech for the need to take action on this, which I think was much more effective than having an academic economist make the same point. But bigger places are more open to building, so more concentration on big cities makes sense. The big battle, and this is claim number 3, is in the state houses, where state legislatures, but not the federal government, have the capacity to either reduce local power to restrict building or to incentivize building. And we'll come back to those two options in a second. And claim number 4 is, to the extent there was a federal role, I think there's largely a federal role in trying to nudge the legislatures to take this up, okay? Probably by tying federal dollars to doing the right thing on this. And I will come back to that later. Okay, so this is just my mocking of suburban homeowners. So again, environmental rhetoric is a normal justification for this, but they've got it completely backwards. This measures the total emissions cost from a marginal home. So this is how much home energy you're using and how much driving the typical home is associated with across metropolitan areas and how restricted the area is. And you can see that the places that have by far the least levels of natural, of emissions costs are these 4 coastal California metropolitan areas, which are also the most restrictive areas in terms of building, right? And so if you are an actual sensible California environmentalist, what you should be doing is saying, yes, build in the San Francisco Bay and build now. Build big, right? Let's get tens and thousands of Americans living in the Bay Area with access to BART, and that's how we're going to fix things, right? That's not something you hear very often from environmentalists, historically. Now, there is a wing of the YIMBY movement that actually gets this, that actually is in favor of that, and that's great. This is from the work of Clémence Tricot, who is a graduate student formerly. I was on her committee. She now teaches at UCLA. What this shows is the impact of mergers of French jurisdictions on the amount of permitting, where little jurisdictions, which are just as NIMBYist in France as they are in the US, got put into bigger jurisdictions. The little jurisdictions, when they got folded in, ended up permitting much more, which is, I think, the best social science evidence we have that, in fact, you put in larger jurisdictions, you actually get more building, which I don't think that this leads me to an agenda that I'm going to try to artificially, cause small towns to get merged into each other. That seems like a fool's errand in terms of American politics. But it does mean that if I'm going to spend effort, it's sure as heck not going to be going around to small towns where there aren't any businesses and trying to persuade them, right? It means that we should focus on the larger cities if we're going to engage in persuasion. The fixes are likely to come through state-level efforts. And I'm going to make use in what follows in both a great deal of wisdom that was given to me by David Schleicher of Yale Law School and throwing out an idea before I go to my idea that was given to me by Bob Ellickson, also of Yale Law School. Both of these guys are fantastic allies on this. So what's going on right now? So California for 50 years, and it hasn't really been very effective, has had a Regional Housing Needs Act, which allegedly allocates an amount of housing to all these different jurisdictions in California, and has various forms of penalties if they don't allow enough building. Okay, it's been fairly toothless, and the way this works is that the Regional Housing Needs Act allocates housing assessments, and then communities need to submit housing elements, which are the sort of zoning changes that they're going to allow so that they're going to be able to meet those assessments, right? Meaning you're supposed to build 1,000 new units. How are you going to change your zoning plan so that's going to be possible? If cities fail to reach assessments, not a code question, this is, thank goodness, is an actual question about building, they lose their ability to reject projects on an ad hoc basis. And you can see why this is pretty toothless. So this means you cannot arbitrarily say no to a project. Now, you probably shouldn't be arbitrarily saying no to many projects anyway, but you can still zone as restrictively as you want. You can still have all the extra environmental rules you want or the extra building rules you want. So this, this kicker is a fairly weak thing. There is a stronger thing, which is if the agency fails to certify their element, meaning that they just decided that what they're proposing is just far too little, then in fact they are in a different situation where they're possibly, and David informs me that it's there are legal uncertainties about this, but it may be that then developers who include more than 20% affordable in what they do, right, get a total bypass from local zoning. So they get to follow, basically they have a ruleless thing. That's powerful. So essentially, it is in the power of the state certifier of the elements to say, look, you're just not in compliance, right? In which case, your zoning doesn't matter for anyone who's over 20% affordable. That is somewhat similar to Massachusetts Chapter 40B. And this stuff, if enforced more stringently, under the laws that are already under the books, right? It's just a question of how much you want to enforce it, right? This is a lot more powerful than SB 9, which passed last year to a lot of fanfare, which basically allows people to split their lots into making 2 lots out of 1, which is a very minor adjustment. Still a move in the right direction, but unlikely to deliver the sort of very large-scale housing that California needs. Other developments. So there are interesting things in different places. So this is in Massachusetts. I'm quoting from Mass Municipal. Section 3A of Chapter 48 of the zoning law enacted requires MBTA communities to have at least one zoning district of reasonable size near a transit station in which multifamily housing is permitted as a right, or risk a loss of eligibility for funding from the state's MassWorks program, Housing Choice Initiative, or Local Capital Projects Fund. Now, I don't think any of Massachusetts' rich communities are going to care about this. So it's kind of toothless in terms of those places, but at least it creates some form of incentive to actually upzone around public transportation, which is helpful. There is a bunch of small-scale action in New York in which the legal issues appear to be whether or not the city should be given deference in interpreting the zoning code, typically in a more liberal fashion. And there are a bunch of NIMBY judges who have said no, and then a bunch of them have been overturned upon appeal. So this seems to be one of the actions here that's kind of interesting. Minnesota, the news is bad, okay? I'm quoting from Planet Tizen here. Environmentalists have used the power of the legal system to protect the car-centric status quo of single-family zoning once again, overturning a landmark planning innovation in Minneapolis. Right? That's not good. Once again, the sort of the right environmental answer, which is to allow more dense building, gets thrown out for spurious environmental reasons. And there's a very interesting case, David tells me, of a lawsuit in Woodbridge, Connecticut, that is, sort of engaging in a large-scale attack on restrictive zoning more generally, alleging that it violates due process, equal protection, and anti-segregation elements in the state constitution. So stay tuned. Now, Ellickson has, in the way that sort of is more common for economists than lawyers, Ellickson has a big idea, okay? And his idea basically follows both the Oregon model of the Land Conservation Development Commission and also the sort of California model of having a state agency whose job it is to oversee localities and to get them not to misbehave. So just quoting, I think this is a fun quote because it reminds us of something that many of us have forgotten, that as Herbert Hoover's panel recognized, state legislatures have fulsome power over land use regulation. This is an Ellickson quote. And the reason for this is, in fact, the wave of zoning that came across the United States was not done without federal assistance. Right? Herbert Hoover, as Secretary of Congress, convened a panel where essentially they pushed the idea of these model zoning codes on localities throughout the country. Right? This is the era of Euclid v. Amber, where the Supreme Court said that these single-use zones were fine. And Herbert Hoover was there leading the charge, encouraging localities to do this. So this is Ellickson's core recommendation. So he wants there to be a state, some form of legislation that basically gives an agency that is then established power to actually move localities in a major way. So his core recommendation is that the legislature establish a state agency, but charge it with a mission narrower than that of the Oregon LCDC. The Oregon thing predictably has 8 different jobs, one of which is to stop NIMBYist regulation, but it has a lot of other things built in, many of which, of course, are contradictory. Okay, so this is a not unusual thing. The agency is meant to gather data and then enforce state ordinances. The state agency can monitor local governments and impose penalties for bad faith noncompliance. Those penalties can either be financial, which is the Massachusetts suggestion with this you lose the access to MassWorks, or far more powerfully, the builder's remedies, which say, look, you're in noncompliance, you lose your ability to zone. The builders can just come in, right? Which is a very powerful thing. And so the idea that, this seems to me like one view of like what effective state action would look like. You create a state agency whose job is to stop localities from over-regulating, right? They have a clear set of rules, they have powers, they set some form of standards, and if the localities don't follow the standards, they get punished in some sort of way. Now, how are we going to get states to do this, or when they create these agencies to not make them toothless, as they were in the case of California, but actually empowered? So my suggestion is that I wrote an op-ed in the Times in this a couple of years ago, that in fact we do more to tie federal funding to state behavior on this. This is a national issue at this point in time. This is national GDP that's suffering. It's our national productivity that's at stake. It's our national ability to fund our own defense that's in the offing. We can and should be using national tools because in some sense when California regulates, it impacts the rest of the country, but they're not there. They don't get to vote. Right? Just as when New York City regulates, no one from other jurisdictions get to vote. And in some sense, the federal government is just trying to internalize the fact that localities have larger impacts. I've tried to argue throughout this. So I think the most plausible one is infrastructure spending. And I think it's also the most likely to pass constitutional muster. Now, what's not okay constitutionally, again, this is what the lawyers tell me, is that, in fact, if you set out and say, oh, I want to change what localities do or change what state law is by using the power of federal funds, that's not allowed. What is allowed is saying, look, we're not going to fund infrastructure in places where you're not allowed to build. Because the benefits of infrastructure are a lot higher when you actually can adjust to that. And so that seems to me like the most sensible thing, is the targeting can be tied to the state level or to counties. I'm even happy if we just talk about it any time a state like California is considering a legislation on this, right? Because it will give the legislators who want to permit more housing something to say, and we're going to lose access to state highway funding if you don't do this. But this feels like the most powerful thing that we could do at the national government, because we're never going to. I have had conversations with national officials about housing and local zoning since the Clinton administration, and every single one of them has thought that the problem of local overregulation is a problem, and none of them has had any ability to actually do anything about it. Because the nature of American law is these things run through state legislatures. This is not an issue for Congress to do. And so unless you can do something that increases the incentives for state legislators to take action, this is it's not going to happen. Now, I'm going to end I'm just going to end on something that's just a little soup sauce, something I hope to do in a future Wilson lecture, which is on how America actually does have a real infrastructure problem. Now, it turns out there's actually some simpler solutions to this infrastructure problem than actually large-scale federal spending. But the way I know about this is I have a universe of data for a month in 2020 of Uber road roughness data. And what Uber road roughness data is when you drive in an Uber car, that every place they go, they're beaming back their speeds. They're beaming back what's happening to themselves. And they beam back not just horizontal acceleration, not just in 2 dimensions, but in 3 dimensions. And vertical acceleration is the most natural measure of road roughness. It corresponds quite well with the things that the Department of Transportation has been doing for decades. And so I can show you, so this is what vertical acceleration looks on a drive from the downtown Chicago to O'Hare. Bumpy at the start, smooth, bumpy again. Over there is just the redder areas are the rougher areas, right? There is, unsurprisingly, a very substantial gulf between the roughness in poorer parts of Chicago and the roughness in richer parts of Cook County. There's a huge jump just at the Evanston state line. There's slight complications, which is that you've got to deal with the fact that this vertical acceleration goes up as you're going faster. It turns out if you have millions and millions of rides, that's relatively easy to correct for. And I will just give you, this is what happens when you resurface road segments. Now, I'm not going to give you sort of facts about what parts of America are bumpy or not. You need to come back next year or whenever we do this to actually get this. But I will say something that is really quite clear, that in fact, the obvious thing that is the low-hanging fruit on America's infrastructure is the way that localities do road repaving, right? That in fact, it is incredibly poorly targeted. And if you look at this change at Chicago, this change is much smaller in road roughness with a repaving event than it is just at the Chicago northwestern border, Chicago-Evanston border. That in fact, Chicago is targeting its road paving not to places that are particularly rough. They have just, like many cities, they just have a cycle. They go through the cycle. There's no attempt to use the fact that we now have reams of big data for targeting road repaving where we want to do it. And even holding constant the total dollars spent on road repaving, we can have huge improvements in the quality of life in our city streets just if we target this stuff in a sensible way, rather than wherever there is convenient for the agency to do or whatever history has meant. So stay tuned for that going forward. I'm going to close it down now and ask for questions, but I want to just repeat my central message that I started with. Okay? Housing regulation is no longer a small local issue. It's a national issue. It's an issue that drives housing cycles, which drive financial cycles. It's an issue that drives the productivity of the country. It's an issue that drives overall upward mobility in this country. And by allowing these regulations to fester and to spread, we have led to an America that is much less open, much less dynamic than it should be. Second point, we can't fix this either directly by the national government or in many of our localities that just have no interest. It has to work through the state legislature. Some part of this is direct action at the state level. Some part of it could help, and the most natural thing to help is to tie spending where the benefits of that spending is related to new construction, to tie that federal fund flow at least somewhat to whether or not the locality is, whether or not the state is actually making it easier to build. So let me stop then and open it up for questions. Thank you. Yes, sir. And you've got to wait for the mic.
Thank you for your best presentation yet, and that's a high bar. I have a related question. In terms of addressing progressives, you mentioned upward mobility. The related issue is widening wage inequality. You mentioned skepticism about the HSIEH findings. Do you think that if progressives care about widening income inequality, they should care about this issue? Oh, sorry.
Absolutely.
Okay, and then a second related question. I didn't completely understand your environmental impact issue. You're saying that if we only liberalize the housing regulations, then it could actually lead to a decline in carbon emissions.
Yes.
Okay. Could you elaborate on those two points?
Yes, absolutely. So that was the point of this graph. That in fact, this is from a paper that I wrote 10 years ago with Matthew Kahn called The Greenness of Cities. No, I think I already skipped it. We make 2 points in this paper, one of which is just how much greener cities like New York are than surrounding suburbs, from 2 primary reasons, one of which is lower driving. Okay, so you're just, and in most of America's cities where you see this gulp, it's not about public transportation versus driving, because people who live in Central City, Kansas City, they ain't taking public transportation. But they're driving 3 miles instead of 30. Okay, so that's a substantial gap. The second thing is, it's not that, in fact, apartment buildings are magically greener than single-family detached houses. Indeed, per square foot, they're actually less green. Okay, but people who live in apartment buildings, holding income and family size constant, that's important to do this on this. You have to hold income and family size constant because suburban families aren't the same as urban families. But holding those things constant, people who live in apartments just do a lot less home heating and cooling because they have a lot less square footage. Right? And the urban model, which means I'm going to have a smaller home, but I'm going to share that space, that's sort of intrinsically green. And I want to emphasize again, like a point that every time I sort of say things which are pro-city, I want to highlight one thing, which is, it's certainly true that I love cities, I love this city. Fundamentally, as an economist, I believe in freedom to make choices, not that people should have one type of choice. So I just want to highlight that thing. I think it's a great thing that America has lots of different living options, some of which are suburbs, some of which are low-density America. But don't act as if restricting housing in the city is somehow or other good for the environment, because the opposite is true. This point makes a second point with the paper, which is looking across metropolitan areas, not within metropolitan areas. And this point just takes our estimate of the total greenness or total brownness of building at the metropolitan area level. And there's a range here, right? So these are the least ones. This is the total cost. These are the most ones. The most restrictive parts of America, right, are the places that are intrinsically greenest. That's not because of anything that California has done with its environmental rules. It's because of January and July temperatures. Okay? The California is intrinsically much more moderate in terms of its temperature. It has a Mediterranean climate. And so you do not need to freeze the environment for 6 months of the year as you would in Arizona to make it habitable. And you don't need to boil it for 6 months of the year, which you do in much of the Rust Belt or Northeast. And because you have this comfortable climate, right, you just don't need anywhere near the same level of electricity or home heating energy. And so if California environmentalists really care about reducing carbon emissions, right, then they should be championing, right, more building and fighting against every restriction that makes it hard to build in the San Francisco Bay Area or Los Angeles or San Jose.
Could you elaborate on widening income inequality in this issue a little bit?
Okay, that's it. So widening income inequality is it's a different point, but the point there is like the most extreme version of this, I think, is this graph. Right? And there's a point that I've made in previous James Q. Wilson lectures, which is that, in fact, the gap in incomes, the gap between the working poor and prosperous people in almost every dimension of well-being is much smaller than the gulf between the working poor and the long-term jobless. Right? The long-term jobless are much worse off below happiness, suicide, divorce, every measure, because, in fact, a job isn't just an income. Right? It's a sense of purpose. It's a sense of social connection. And the long-term jobless lose that. Okay, now, whatever fraction of this you think has something to do with the fact that you can live on your parents' couch in Tennessee, and you can't live on, your parents don't have a couch for you in San Jose, and it's ungodly expensive to rent, and it's some fraction. I'm not prepared to give you a number, but whatever fraction of that is coming from housing policy is directly attributing to the inequality of America at its worst. And I would just highlight, if we go back 100 years ago, that didn't happen. People didn't stay in poor parts of America, right, where they were jobless for prime age people were jobless for long periods of time because it was too expensive to move into some area. This was, there was cheap housing, right? I mean, remember, New York stayed affordable in the 1920s. New York had tenements. New York built over 100,000 units a year in some years, and because it built, it stayed affordable, and because of that, it, remained a place in which people could come and find opportunity. And that's not possible in the same way today. Yes, sir.
Great presentation.
Thank you. Wait for the mic.
Question, to what extent are the higher wages in places like the Northeast and California driven by higher productivity versus constrained labor supply?
So, prices always and everywhere, whether or not they're housing prices or wages, which are the price of labor, reflect the confluence of demand and supply, right? This is the twin scissors of Alfred Marshall, the sort of core insight. You could not have higher wages in a place like New York if you did not also have higher productivity. But if you higher marginal productivity of labor, at least if you have a view that this is a competitive labor market, so that is a necessity. But those wages would fairly quickly resume down to national levels if you supplied enough so that it was cheap to live in New York. Okay, so it's always both. So you can't it's sort of, and it's a question as to whose perspective you're thinking of from. So the high wages for a worker, right? The fact that this is sort of an equilibrium that works means that that has all to do with housing, right? So the high housing for the worker's decision is offset by the high wages are offset by the high housing prices. For the firms, right? I'm going to slightly misquote the great Chicago economist Bob Lucas. Why would you be locating in New York or Chicago, right, and paying ungodly rents and paying much higher wages if you weren't more productive as a result of being there? Right? Probably from being around other firms. So both things are necessary. Yes, sir. Wait for the mic, please.
I have two thoughts, and not really to push back, but kind of I think it's very interesting. So first of all,
you can push back. I'm very happy to argue.
Well, I mean, just first of all, obviously the population in the country, 80 years ago was a lot smaller, right? So I mean, I'm from Europe, and obviously, if you have now 330 million people and you had 150 million people 50 years ago, I would imagine that sort of the more people there are, the less land there is, and sort of, the more pushback there is.
You can put the whole world on 10th-acre lots in the states of Texas and Oklahoma combined.
But nobody wants to live there.
Nobody wants to live in Texas?
Well, Oklahoma, I mean...
all right, fine. Give me Arizona, then. It'll work the same way. And America has ungodly amounts of land.
And then the other point,
unbelievable amounts of land at any reasonable population density level.
And the other point here, which is I think more relevant in a place like New York, which is I kind of think of the taxi medallion. So I mean, you think of New York, and as you say, the rents are really expensive, and the wages are high, and therefore you're in an equilibrium that works, right? But you said, if we allowed a lot more housing in New York, a lot more people would move to New York, right? And therefore, the wages would go down. So all those people who bought in New York at those very high prices and, have those very expensive mortgages or whatnot, they would therefore be losing out. And if the people that have the keys to the kingdom in this particular situation are sort of the state governments, and the role of the state governments is to represent kind of their constituents, aren't we on some level, by allowing a lot more housing, kind of giving more opportunity for people who are out of state and sort of would kind of benefit by moving to these states, so there's more opportunity, but we would, to some extent, would we not be disadvantaging those people, who bought kind of in this housing market where the housing prices are artificially high, and then kind of connected to the wages? And so how do you sell that? How do you sell that to a state government?
So that's exactly the point of why the federal government should be engaged. Is that in fact New York restricting is making it harder for people who don't live here, who currently live in Eastern Tennessee, to move here. That's causing harm throughout the country that is caused by regulatory decisions here in New York. That's precisely why there's a case for some degree of federal action on this to try and nudge the state legislature. Moreover, I will push back on the idea that if we think the job of governments is to maintain asset prices for a particularly elite bunch of property owners, that is a very restricted and unpleasant view of government from the vision that I would have thought was more attractive, which is enabling opportunity for everyone, right? Not just for insiders who have bought their condos on Park Avenue, but for outsiders who, are trying to find some bright future. And that means not protecting always the insiders at the expense of the outsiders. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. Outstanding presentation. I was curious if you've encountered or discussed in your work any of the ideas around land value taxes, Georgism, This is a topic I've been increasingly interested in the last year or so, in particular how just land values, especially in cities, form a huge obstacle in some cases to building. You sometimes have distortions in urban property markets with land speculation. Would just love to hear if there's an interplay between land use reform, land value taxes, property tax reforms, and some of the goals you discussed in this presentation.
Great question. Okay, so Henry George. So for those of you who haven't been reading your Henry George lately, right? So Henry George was a 19th century giant of like the public intellectual sphere, right? Just a giant. And his whole idea was that by taxing land, right, by having a tax that's tied to the value of land, you would both have a tax that was relatively non-distortionary, right? Because unlike a property taxation, which discourages you from building, the land's there, and whether or not you're using the land as a ground level garage or you're building a skyscraper on it, you pay the same tax. So it doesn't create this disincentive to build. So that is exactly right, and I think most economists who have been in this space thought that George was pretty smart about this for a long time, right? Where George is a little nutty is his then view that if we just tax land, then all the problems of the world disappear, right? There's a whole bunch of that stuff, which, like, yeah, okay, like you had me on the like no bad incentives. It didn't solve all of inequality and all of everything, right? It's we still need police, okay? It's a perfectly good idea. It's not that I would just do it by taking property values and I would subtract off the estimated cost of building the structures. That's how I would do it. I wouldn't try to do it in a way that was more sophisticated than that. So I would start with the existing property values, and then I would just give a discount based on whether or not there was a. The thing I worry a little bit about is like the garage, the ground level parking lots, where probably the assessments are too low relative to the actual value of that land anyway. But so we need to think a little about the edges. But I think it's also a helpful thing because it reduces the disincentive to build. It feels less first order to me than actually the land use regulation, but I think it's a useful thing to have happen. The only unhelpful thing about it is that there is a slight positive benefit that comes from property taxation in terms of nudging localities to build, probably more in the commercial space. And if you reduce that incentive, that could be slightly harmful. I'm still for it, but that's the one thing that I worry about on this. Yes, sir.
So I think earlier on in the talk you showed this slide from the Federal Reserve, and it showed a steep rise in housing prices in 2021 and onward, in the very beginning.
Yeah. So this is nominal. Yeah. Oh shoot! I did a bad thing. Okay. This is. Can someone fix? Okay. Yes. Right. There's a steep nominal shift. There's also a real shift as well. So housing prices, like particularly in a place like Austin, real prices went up by 40% between 2019 and 2021.
So you said that we don't fully understand the demand side of this, and you mentioned
there are lots.
Some
possibilities. When I say we don't fully demand, we've got an abundance of stories.
Yeah.
Okay. There's no absence of like stories and potential explanations. I mean that the scientific literature is not converged on which of these stories is right or how much weight to put on each one of these stories.
So that's what I wanted to ask you about. Is like in particular, to what extent do you think the rapid increase in the quantity of money, M2, and also Federal Reserve policy on interest rates could account for that steep rise after the shutdown?
So I typically don't. Okay. So there are really two questions that are wrapped up in that. So one of which is, how strongly do I believe housing prices are tied to interest rates and monetary policy? I was involved in this debate in the last housing crisis, and I took the view that in fact the available evidence was that these relationships were much weaker than many of the advocates who thought that there was a very tight tie. And so I think the right number over the sort of 40 to 50 year time horizon is that 100 basis point swing is associated in interest rates and real rates is associated with about a 6 to 7% change in housing prices. So the effect is real, it matters, but it doesn't get you 30, 40% rate changes. So I would not blame low interest rates. I mean, over the long haul, certainly did it make a difference. Is there perhaps some interesting thing where the cocktail of speculative expectations then merges together with easy money to create a bubble? I think that's entirely possible. But it's not like it's a simple, you always change interest rates, you always get this kind of effect. So that's on the housing side. On like rising inflation rates, this is I have many people who are my colleagues who know much more about this than myself. I actually recently did a podcast with Larry Summers on this, who was very prescient in terms of pushing this. I would say that the preponderance of views on this probably puts most of the blame on the fiscal side. The second stimulus bill, the extra 1.9 trillion, rather than straight monetary policy. But it is certainly true that if you had combined the fiscal side with much tighter monetary policy, you probably would have had much less of an inflationary boost. But we have certainly put ourselves in a pickle in terms of and it's a remarkable thing. I think there's a lesson on that, which I'll just highlight, which is that someone like Larry got this right because he didn't actually just rely on a sort of simple statistical model. He relied on history, he relied on analogy, he relied on sort of common sense. And that's sort of, there's the lesson there, is that when our policymakers or our economists in other realms just park their common sense and just rely on a statistical model alone, right? It should be part of the equation, but shouldn't dictate it. Like, mistakes get made, as they were certainly made in this case. Yes, one last question, I think.
How can we get big boys who are into like property and construction? How can we encourage them to invest in New York? For example, like from my experience from NYU, Dancote, Ali Dancote, who is the richest in Africa, came up with 20 million for investment in Harlem, and Bill Gates came up with 5 million. How can we rally around, like, not only to depend on the Fed from public sector, but from private sector to invest in money, in the revamping economy of New York? There are a lot of people willing to invest, but it's something like rallying around, which I believe, rallying around and encouraging those people to invest in New York.
So I believe very strongly with firms, with firms and with outside real estate investors. Like, you work on the fundamentals and you get them strong. I am constantly frustrated by big city economic development chiefs who think the important thing is to chase down Amazon or Boeing and like get a simple win rather than focus on how is it that we make the basic environment good. Making that, I'm a big believer that, city economy, the best urban economic development strategy is to attract and train smart people and then get out of their way, right? That's not something that happens easily. That requires a combination of relatively sensible taxation policies that actually, make sure that we're, not taxing the golden goose, that we're not trying to run a local redistribution center that basically, deters wealthier people and firms from locating in the area. It requires trying to do something to hold down the cost of city government, which is, of course, incredibly hard in a place like New York. But there's always room to be made for improvement on this. I become personally obsessed with procurement reform, which I will not inflict on you as a future James Q. Wilson lecture. But it still is incredibly important. It's where 15% of global GDP goes on public procurement. It's about those basic quality of life attributes, which are constantly at risk of going out of line in a place like New York, and making sure that potential investors know that it's not just that we're going to make sure New York is safe now. We're going to make sure New York is safe in 5 years. We're going to make sure New York is safe in 10 years. Right? This is going to be a constant commitment of the city, which is obviously sort of completely central. So I don't think it's an issue of convincing a particular investor on a project-by-project basis. That feels like a fool's errand to me. I think the right thing is to get this city in a place in which it is open for business, where it is a place in which smart entrepreneurs want to be, and businesses think that it's a place to invest for the long haul because the city is safe and it has been productive and it has been incredibly entrepreneurial for the last 400 years, and it will be for the next 100 years as well. So thank you for your question.
Just on behalf of all of us at MI, thank you very much to Professor Glaeser, and thanks to all of you for being here. We greatly appreciate it, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you.